I want to take a few moments today and talk about biases. I wrote about in my latest book, I wrote about something that to me was very critical in order for me to be able to come to an understanding of truth. You shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free. This is what Jesus said. And I began to pursue truth. But you realize that most of us are not really seekers of truth. Most of us look for information, or we're looking for someone to confirm what we already believe. We have biases, or we have a prejudice or pre-critical inclination in favor of or against something. And I recently heard an interesting podcast by a person named Brian McLaren. And he talks about 13 biases that affect the way we perceive or the way we see things. So we see reality. So, and I want to give them to you. And if I'll give you at the end more information about where you can learn more about this. This is not something I came up with, but I really, really enjoyed it. And I thought it would be interesting for all of us to take a few moments and just think about it, how it applies to our own lives, especially when it comes to this election and also beyond the election, the way we live our lives. So the first one is the confirmation bias. The human brain welcomes information that confirms what it already thinks and resists information that disturbs or contradicts what it already thinks. You can see that, right? And this is what we already discussed. And then you have complexity bias. The human brain prefers a simple lie to a complex truth, because a simple lie is, your brain uses less energy. From the very beginning, we need energy. There was a lack of food. So, the brain then try to limit the way we think, because if it's too complex of an idea, we don't want to waste energy. So the human brain prefers a simple lie to a complex truth. Then you have community bias. The human brain finds it very hard for you to see something your group doesn't want you to see. In other words, we put tribe over truth. This is also known as social confirmation bias. I think a lot of us can see this in ourselves, right? And then we have complementary bias. If people are nice to you, and we all want people to be nice to us, right? You'll be open to what they see and have to say. If they are nice to you, you won't be. We mirror back the attitude we receive from other people, and that makes us open or close to what they have to say, whether it's true or not. And then we have contact bias. If you like contact with someone, you won't see what they see. So you see that as well. That's why people from different races and different nationalities and different religions, well, they have this suspicion of one another. Why? Because they're not close to one another. And then, for example, politically, you have a conservative liberal bias. Our brains like to see as our party sees, and we flock with those who see as we do. Wow, that would explain a lot of things. And then we have a consciousness bias. Our brains see from the location a person's level of consciousness, or we could say their cognitive maturity makes seeing some things possible and seeing other things impossible. We can all see this in our own lives, right? Think about it. 30 years ago, you may have believed completely differently than you do today. What happened in the meantime? Your level of consciousness rose. You see things today that you didn't see back then. And you can't even understand how you could see things the way you did 30 years ago. So there's a consciousness bias, and there's a competency bias. And in other words, our brains prefer to think of ourselves as above average. Well, we all do, right? We all like to think of ourselves as above average, which is rooted in our ego. As a result, we are incompetent at knowing how incompetent or competent we really are. That's competency bias. And then we have confidence bias. Our brains prefer a confident lie to a hesitant truth. We mistake confidence for competence, and we're all vulnerable to the lies of confident people. And then we have conspiracy bias. When we feel shame, We're especially vulnerable to stories that cast us as victims of an evil conspiracy by some enemy or other. In other words, our brains like stories in which we're either the hero or the victim, but never the villain. And then we have a comfort or complacency or convenience bias. Our brains welcome data that allows us to relax and be happy, and our brains reject data that requires us to adjust, work, or inconvenience ourselves. We could say the brain is lazy, but it's very fast at being very lazy. How do you think about that one? And then we have catastrophe or normalcy or baseline bias. Our brains are wired to set a baseline of normalcy and assume that what feels normal has always been and will always remain. That means that we minimize threats and we're vulnerable to disasters, especially disasters that develop slowly. Wow. There's a lot of thoughts there we could give to that as far as the pandemic currently. And then the last one, but perhaps one of the most powerful, is a cash bias. Our brains are wired to see within the framework of our economy, and they see what helps us make money. It is very hard to see anything that interferes with our way of making a living. Those are 13 biases. So the question that I ask myself, what biases do I have? And I think if you're honest about that question, if you actually honestly consider that question, and we may come to a different conclusion right now than we have right now. And anyhow, I talked about this, and I talked a little bit about this, and this is really the beginning of my book called Awakening to I Am Love. The first chapter is about biases and in search of truth, and how for me, I had to move beyond these thoughts, I had to learn how to move beyond the thoughts and these subconscious biases that I had, and just become aware of this infinite presence of love and grace and peace within me, the very divine presence, and recognizing that I'm one with God, I'm one with everyone. And the moment I recognized that, it so transformed my life. So, but still, I'll ask myself these questions. I look at these things and I say, what biases do I still have? How do I treat people? How do I treat people who see things differently than me? How can I awaken more and more so that I have less of these biases and that I can see the world through more of a, what I call a God, see the world through the eyes of God. I'll conclude with this, and I'm going to teach about this soon, and you may be able to find it on YouTube. Jesus said to a bunch of people come from all kinds of different backgrounds, you are the light of the world. He was very inclusive of everybody. He didn't say Christians, he didn't say Muslims, he didn't say Jews, they didn't even have Christians and Muslims at the time, but you know what I'm talking about. He didn't specify who. He spoke to everybody. You are the light of the world. And that to me is seeing with less biases. That's seeing less from a perspective of the ego. That's seeing less from this perspective of our ethno-tribal views. It is seeing more through the eyes of God. So think about this and think about how this affects your life today. Thanks for listening.